Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
When such an order as this moves in and takes over the police power, you are completely at their mercy. And their atrocities and their violence can be visited on anybody that disagrees with them in any given situation.
Welcome. Our guest today is Nation Benz. She is a historian and curator of collections and exhibits at the Quincy Museum. She has history degrees from Quincy University and Western Illinois University. Nancy has studied and lectured on a number of subjects, including our topic of discussion today, the women behind the hoods, an in-depth look at the women of the Ku Klux Klan, its leaders, and the appropriation of feminism. In addition to her work at the Quincy Museum, she does research on a variety of historical topics for her blog, #Tracking History. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's great. And this is what I thought was, when you were doing your research, this is kind of a somewhat dangerous topic.
Oh, yes. It is. It's gotten me in a little bit of trouble.
You know, and when I was looking into, because I do some research too, I try to, make sure that I'm up to speed, and I'm a history major and everything myself, but I want to make sure I'm up to speed and on the topic. And then I like to find some audio clips. I'm like, this one in particular, these audio clips, some of them I don't really want to use, even though, we kind of I pride myself on covering every topic, even the tough ones, but some of those clips are pretty tough.
Yeah, they're a little negative.
Yeah, a little negative.
I'm trying to be nice here. They were very harsh, but it depicts the time that America was in. And I think that's something that's very important, and women in the Klan in general gets overlooked quite a bit in the historical narrative.
Oh, no question.
And that's one reason why I chose to study it.
No, it's all great reasons. Now, it's tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. And so today we have Zon Belgian-styled wheat beer from the Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City, Missouri. Have you ever been to Kansas City?
I have.
Have you been to the Boulevard Brewery?
I have not.
It's a cool tour.
It's probably something my husband would really enjoy.
He would like it. He would like it. You'll have to go because it's pretty cool. Zon actually means sun in Flemish.
I did not know that.
I don't speak Flemish, but I did a little research. Yeah. And this is designed to be like a summer brew. So I'm going to try Zon today. And remember to subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment, suggest a future feature beer for a chance to win a gift card. So Nancy, you picked, as we mentioned before, a pretty provocative, dangerous topic for your research. What drew you to that particular chapter of American history?
I grew up in a very small rural town. It's based, in agriculture, and there had always been rumors that just to the north of us in Fort Madison, Iowa, there was always a Klan chapter that was active. And I always wondered about it. And then when I was in undergrad at Quincy University, I went on a civil rights memorial trip, essentially, where we visited Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama. Wow. And when we were there, we went to the Southern Law Poverty Center.
Sure.
And in their little museum area, they have a Klan regalia costume from the 20s. And it just looks at you, and you just get this feeling of like dread and hate. And you just wonder what was going on to make people think that this hatred and discrimination was okay.
Now, do you think children is brought up to mix the black and white together? Do you know your horse won't mix with your cow, your dog won't mix with your hog, and you tell me white people has got a mind and can't think no clearer than that?
And so I came back, and at the time I was in my second part seminar, and I switched my subject completely from my first semester, and I just decided to go after that. And while I was reading, I came across that the Women of the Ku Klux Klan was its own organization during the 20s. And a lot of it, or a lot of history of it, I should say, isn't explored. And so that's kind of what got me into it.
Well, I commend you for it.
Thank you.
I really do, because sometimes it's easy. So when I did my research back, now that was a long time ago. But
Oh, it wasn't that long time ago.
it was on the Alger Hiss case. So that was one of my areas of focus. So a little bit after your time period, but that's also a challenging subject because there was some hatred and vitriol during that time period too. But let's go back a little further. Let's go back to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. Right after the Civil War.
Yep.
These Confederate leaders, many military officers, no longer allowed to serve in positions of power or authority like they had been accustomed to.
Exactly.
Right. So take us back to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan.
So what happened was, after the Civil War ended, these Confederate soldiers that ended up forming the Ku Klux Klan, they were threatened by the fact that their freed slaves now have a political and economic stake in Southern society. And before that, they could control everything that their slaves did, from how much, they could praise in church to how they would speak to how they would dress. And now that the Civil War is over and the slaves are freed, they're scared that they're losing all their power and authority over a big sector of their population. And so one of them, the most famous, and there's still some controversy around this, that Nathan Bedford Forrest formed the Ku Klux Klan on Christmas Eve, 1866, I believe. And while they were doing that, they decided, we're going to dress up in robes. It's going to be secretive. We're going to terrorize our freed Black community and the white supporters who help them, voice their political opinion, get them any sort of economic independence, things along that line. And that's where you get this classic white-robed horsemen terrorizing image.
So, yeah, that's exactly what it initially was for, just to scare freed Blacks, or like you had mentioned, maybe some whites, maybe some Northerners who had been down into the South, scare them back. And when those tactics don't work, and when Reconstruction turns into military Reconstruction, and the Union Army is there forcing these things on these former Confederates, then it starts to become more violent, and it becomes incredibly violent. So where there's lynchings and murders, and at first, that's not how it started, as you mentioned. It was just a way to scare people back into what they felt into line.
Yeah, a scare tactic, very plain and simple. And then as things progressed, and people were or these men specifically, like you said, were getting more violent, people started recognizing it more, that, oh my goodness, this is an organization to be, either in or be threatened by, or whatever the situation going through that individual's mind.
Well, they fight the war. From Grant's perspective, he becomes president after Johnson, and then that is when the Klan really starts to develop its power. Grant sees it as a true threat, and threatening not only the Republican Party, which was down there, which was pretty much all Black. That was the nature of it. You actually did have, during Reconstruction, Black senators, Black representatives. You had Blacks throughout the governmental system in the South. That is abhorrent to a lot of those white Southerners. And when the Ku Klux Klan rises into power, uses that violence, as long as the Army's there and Grant can use the Army to quell that type of activity. But when the Army leaves and Reconstruction ends,
the public are like, oh my goodness, this is not okay. And, and then they find ways through Jim Crow laws and things along that line to reinstitutionalize segregation and racism, try to put their freed African slaves back in their place, so to speak.
And sometimes I've been asked, and I'm not an expert on this time period really, but I've studied history, and they'll say, well, what happens to the first Ku Klux Klan? Why does it recede? And the reality is the Ku Klux Klan kind of ebbs and flows throughout our history.
Yeah.
And when it's at its height, it has a lot of power. It controls police. It controls local governments. But then they get into these competitions among different groups, and they start fighting against one another. So that's one of the reasons it kind of recedes. But then the government is very forceful. And there's actually something called there was different force plans.
Yeah.
And the third force plan, sometimes we refer to that as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Well, that was in 1871. The Ku Klux Klan at that point had already kind of, there's a famous thing where Nathan Bedford Forrest says, I'm disbanding the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
I don't think that's real. I think that was just like a way for him to get some of the heat off of them or something like that.
And it's common for these imperial wizards throughout the Klan's history to do that. They're getting all this publicity, the negative publicity, and then all of a sudden they come out and they're like, oh, maybe we're going to disband. And they say nicer things to get the heat off of them, like you said.
Well, then we get closer to the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. A lot of things are going on in the country at the time. But through that time period, the South now has been completely dominated by white society again.
Oh, yeah.
Through Jim Crow, which you had mentioned. The segregation laws, the black codes turn into the slave codes turn into the black codes, and eventually just full out segregation in Jim Crow. But something happens in the early 1900s, and you reference it in your writing. What happens in the early 1900s that reinvigorates the Ku Klux Klan?
So what happened was there's this period called progressivism. And essentially that period was from the late 1890s, give or take, to the mid-1920s. Some say through the 1920s. And it's basically a social movement for reform in education, politics, immigration, about any sort of platform you could think of that had some sort of negative aspect to it. Sanitation, for instance. They were, wanting to reform how labor was done. So getting rid of child labor and introducing unions and things along that line. And so when this whole movement was happening, there's a sector, specifically in the South, again, that feel threatened. This way of life, this modernizing America is not good. You're going to basically ruin what America was built on. And there's a certain sector all over, really, that are, they feel threatened by this. And by the time that progressivism is in its height, there was also movements for this lost cause mythology in the South, which was an ideology that was created out of memorializing and retelling the Confederate side of the Civil War. And when that was all going on, this guy named William Joseph Simmons, he was having a vision, so to speak. He claims it was a dream. And he saw it as...
Those types of figures do that.
Yes. He had this vision of uniting white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant males, also known as WASP. And in this dream, he saw, they were uniting and they were going to reinvigorate the Klan and defeat all this corruption going on in America. Because, you can't have anything nice.
When I studied that, and it's exactly right, he takes all this imagery out, or he pulls it out. And there was a famous book written by a guy called Thomas Dixon.
Yep, the Clansman.
The Clansman. So he writes this book, and it goes back to these almost like Scottish royalty or something. It creates
it's a very strange book.
Yeah, it creates this image of like a chivalry, and the old South, the antebellum South before the war, was a perfect place where everyone was happy, including the slaves. And that's what the Klansman does. But what happens during this time period to take the Klansman, which is a book, and then I think they turned it into a screenplay if I started doing plays, but something takes it and makes it into a national movement.
Yeah, so D.W. Griffith, he was a director at the time of silent movies, and he created or adapted the Klansman into a movie called The Birth of the Nation. And I highly suggest you watch it if you haven't, and in which he sets the narrative that Reconstruction failed. Specifically, it failed the South, but also America as a whole, and or the white population, I guess I should say. And he depicted the Klan as saviors riding on horseback, saving the white women from the savage Negroes and just things like that. And he popularized the Lost Cause mythology in it as well. And about 50 million people.
Which pervades down throughout the decades after that. This idea that Grant, for example, was a butcher and a killer. And the Reconstruction was, as you mentioned, a complete failure. And we had this idyllic South that has been destroyed and replaced. And in The Birth of a Nation, it shows these black characters in the worst stereotypes you can imagine.
Yes.
Lazy, aggressive to white women, all of these things that, the Klan uses as propaganda.
They even demonized the black politicians at the time. And this movie, or the silent film, whichever you want to call it, it captivated over 50 million people. And it helped Simmons gain momentum to form a Ku Klux Klan again. And in fact, in Georgia, I believe it was Atlanta, there was a screening of it, and he heard about it. And the night before, he gathered a whole bunch of people. I can't remember exactly. It was on top of like a mountain type scenery. And he decided, we're going to reform this. We're going to bring it back to life. Watch this movie and you're going to see all what the Klan can do, how it can benefit our society.
The interesting thing about that movie is movies had developed before that. So D.W. Griffith he'd been an actor. He had tried a number of different things in that field. But his real talent was in making movies. And what he does with The Birth of a Nation is make it on a grand scale. Now, we're used to seeing movies on a grand scale where you have huge battles, a number of people on the screen at one time, like maybe whole formations of a battlefield. That hadn't been done before. It just flat out hadn't been done before. So when people see it, it's not just the storyline, it's the visual of it, which is so spectacular to them that draws them in. It was the first movie that was ever shown at the White House. And Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner after the Civil War to get elected to the presidency. Not always open to civil rights, as we know from history. He's actually close friends with Thomas Dixon, which kind of leads them to show this movie at the White House. So it has appeal not just in the area where the Klan is or in the South. It has national appeal. And that affects the Klan in the 1920s because sometimes they say there's like 4 clans. You got the original Klan, which we just referenced. The revival in the
1915. Then you have the revival again in the 50s, 60s. And some even go to the fact after they died down in that decade, there's this resurgence today.
Right, sure. And so this is kind of this rebirth in the late, teens or 1920s is really when
1925 was the peak of this revival that Simmons created.
We don't hate the Negro. God made him black, and he made us white. And you will find this laid out in the 11th chapter of Genesis, in which he segregated the races. And we knowing that for 5,000 years, the white man has been the supreme race, We, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, intend to keep it the white race.
And this Klan is different.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what leads you to your research, because the Klan of the 20s, it has a lot of the components of the Klan from the past, but it takes it to another level. It's not just in the South. It's throughout the country. It's scattered. It's in little pockets. Some cities even. Chicago has
the
a
northern
large
states had a huge population of Klan members.
You know, and the interesting thing is New York City, it never did take hold. And I don't know if it's because the politicians or whatever, but right across the river in New Jersey, they have a massive, Klan in the 1920s. So it is a national Klan where it hadn't been before. And their targets are different.
Yeah, so instead of just solely, villainizing African Americans, Simmons had hoped to have a large membership in the beginning, like right out the bat. He wanted a large membership, but that didn't happen. For whatever reasons, it just did not happen. And so he went to a local agency and he hired Edward Clarke and Mary Tyler Elizabeth as marketing agents. And when he did that, everything just opened up. They marketed the Klan so brilliantly. And it's weird for me to say that, but they did. They took these fears that were being exacerbated in America, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitic, immigration,
the Great Migration of the blacks to the north.
Yes, industrialization, urbanization, all these things that were messing with the traditional American society, they just blew it up. And people from all over, like you said, were forming chapters. And it's really amazing. For me, I think it was Tyler who got the ball rolling, and the historical narrative always gives credit to Clarke, 9 times out of 10. And that's the part that really got to me when I first started studying this. And she was a bigot by all means, but she had some great ideas for that organization, if that makes sense.
Well, you can be a bigot and be an excellent publicist, which is her in the case of Tyler. That's exactly the case. Simmons didn't really care about the money. Later Klan leaders will. He
was very much a big, let's fight this corruption that's going on.
And get as many as we possibly can. Get the numbers up as much. So he cut a deal with Tyler and Clarke. You get 80% of the proceeds. So they know at this point, the more people we get. Yeah,
they charge.
That's why they're so effective at it, because there's a money motive to
so
a profit motive.
I think the membership went to $10, which was quite a bit of money at the time. And out of that $10, they received 60% of it.
Oh, 60%. Okay.
Out of the $10. And so,
so the majority of the money is not even going to the chapter. It's going to the publicity.
Yes. And there's a lot of publicity surrounding her specifically, which I think draws in a lot of people. She was dubbed the Empress of the KKK, and she had a lot of power in a male fraternity, or what people presumed was a male fraternity. And they were questioning this, why does this woman have all this power when it's a male society? And it comes out in a federal investigation. I think it's 2022 or 23, something like that, that these members are accusing her of being the ones that is actually running the Klan and making all the decisions. And a lot of people get offended by that. And so what happens is Simmons decides to chart a women's division. And at first it was just going to be an auxiliary division, because there was already some of those
right. There'd always been women involved in the Klan in some capacity.
Yeah, sewing the hoods,
right.
Providing food, a safe environment for their men to come home to after the meeting. So there's,
I always tied, if I can divert just
ahead.
A second. They were responsible for teaching the children.
Yes.
And this, to me, they always like to hearken back to Revolutionary War time periods of the Patriots. They always called themselves patriots. Yes. And I'm sure the white supremacists today even call themselves patriots as well. That was something that had been a part of their history. But they hearken back to that time period. And in their speeches, they would even say, they walked through snow. Our patriot, founding fathers did these great things.
We need to wake up to God. We had forefathers die to give us freedom. Our forefathers walked barefooted in the snow and fought and died to give us freedom. And now here we sit back because we got a dictator in the White House, a dictating, and you sitting your money down out of bed and ain't willing to stand up and be counted like a man or woman.
But in that time period, the women were responsible for civic virtue, teaching the children, just like George Washington had civic virtue, where he had to move away from Mount Vernon and serve in the military. There's ambition involved in all of that too, but there's a sense of duty that the women, the mothers had taught the children from when they're little. Take it forward to the Klan, the women are responsible to raise the children in the mindset of the Klan. Yeah,
there's this juxtaposition of education, religion, white supremacy, keeping the race pure. All these traits were attributed to women because that's how it's always been. That's their gender. And when Tyler came out and was a multi-divorcee, she ran her own business. She had her own newspaper. She always was trying to, con money out of someone, or con money, excuse me. And, these men are seeing it like, we're supposed to be, protecting women. We're supposed to be making sure they're staying in the home and providing a safe space for children and all these things. And so when she starts gaining power and momentum, that's when some more things happen.
Well, and they pick up on her flaws.
Yes, and her infidelity. Because apparently her and Edward were having an affair. It's not been,
Isn't there a raid where the feds come in and they arrest them and they're in a pretty precarious, both her and Edward are in this.
It's rumored that, they show up and they're in their skivvies and, in bed together and then they're taken away. There's, times, my favorite publicity stunt of hers was when she hired someone, or we think she hired someone, to come to her house and put bullets through her house. And so she was claiming that someone was out to assassinate her. It was all a ruse. But it gained a whole bunch of publicity for them. And more members came forth and were like, hey, we need to protect this lady. So she's
Which was always an element of the Klan, that we have to protect women. That was part of the Klan. So let's go back to the women of the KKK and their separate organization. How does that develop, and how do their goals and teachings differ from the traditional KKK operated by the men?
So what happens is, in this long trial of trying to form a women's organization, Simmons eventually is replaced by, I can't think of his first name. He's a dentist from Texas. His last name is Evans. I can't think of his first name.
I think.
Yes, that's it. And
I remember a few things.
And so at the time when this was all happening, there was also other wizards, so to speak, that in other parts of the United States that were trying to form their own women's organization as well. And it finally went to a local court in Georgia. And when they were there, it was decided that Evans would be in control of starting a separate Klan for women. And in my argument, I feel like Tyler was the catalyst for that, just because she was gaining so much popularity and power in a male organization. And these men are already feeling threatened by the open sexualized culture that's going on. So your flapper image.
Right.
And so Evans has formed the Women of the Ku Klux Klan. It's officially charted in July of 1923, and it was headquartered in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I think they picked Little Rock just because the first Imperial commander was living there at the time. Her name was Lulu Markwell. And she's a fascinating woman as well.
So how did their teachings, because I know that during this time period, the traditional Ku Klux Klan, which tries to present itself as we're open now, like we don't cover our faces anymore. The reality was a lot of laws had been passed where you couldn't do that anymore. But this is the time period where you'll often see people walking around in their Klan uniforms, completely, you could see their face
They weren't
open in society during the broad daylight. This isn't midnight
it wasn't
rides or
secretive
anything like
anymore.
that. It's just like an open society, and they would have these large, gigantic picnics, basically.
Yep, that women were in charge of.
Yes. And so, but the women actually push it forward in ways that the men are struggling with.
Yeah, so
They appear to be more civil, and they appear to be more in line with the progressive era, pushing for reforms in society as opposed to the violence.
yeah, so they were never really involved in those volatile lynchings or beatings or anything like that. Yes, they should be accountable because they let that stuff go on. But they weren't out there physically doing the acts of violence. They were more behind the scenes, so to speak. They picketed their hatred through rallies and publications, picnics. One of their favorites was boycotting. They would be like, "Oh, this business is ran by a Jewish man. Don't go there," and just various things like that. So they weren't openly hating. Their rhetoric was obviously, but their actions they were a lot more subtle.
They were more subtle, and it looked like just a reform movement, which dovetailed with other reform movements that were going on. A
lot of these women that joined the Klan, they were already in either, some sort of social reform movement like temperance, suffrage, education, sanitation. The eugenics movement was a big one. And there's a segue into when the eugenics movement was popping up. Some women's chapters, they believed in the idea of birth control. Not necessarily for, eliminating children that weren't of value or importance or anything, but so they could have some sort of sexual independence. They could control if they could have when and if they wanted children. And a lot of what the Klan's message was the complete opposite. You're supposed to have children, you keep the white race pure, all these things, and you'll be the saviors of America. And they did rely on that image a little bit to gain members. So the image of motherhood was very prevalent in their propaganda. Some people, even some of the leaders, I should say, they advocated for women's rights inside the marriage and outside the marriage. It's a very complex organization, and they say they are for women's rights and equalities, but it's only for those WASP, and it's only for middle class. If you're not middle class or you're not a white American, 100% American, you don't get these rights.
So let's go to that concept, 100% Americanism. And that pervades. That's probably goes down to modern times. It's been a something that runs through the philosophy. What did it mean to be 100% American or 100% Americanism?
So basically, it was essentially any ethnic or racial background that wasn't native born or of European Eastern European, no, Western. Yes, Western European descent. And, you stuck to American ideals. And if you were an immigrant or a person of color, you were expected to conform to Protestantism, any sort of American traditional structure. So the home, things like that, politics, all that stuff.
Rural America.
Yes.
And all of those things that...
Conservatism.
Conservatism. And in the 1920s... The interesting thing about the census of 1920, it's the first time in American history where more people live in urban areas than in rural areas. And it's just indicative of the urbanization, which threatens those rural areas, especially not exclusively in the South, but especially in the South, which had already seen their way of life kind of upturned.
Yeah, and they they already saw what the Klan did before them. It reinvigorates this idea that if we can succeed in eliminating these corrupted systems, we're going to go right back to the ideal days, and everyone's going to be happy.
But the white Protestant Gentile, the only hope and the only salvation that they have left in this United States today is the United Klans of America Incorporated. We saved the South twice, or the Klan has, and it looks like we're going to have to do it again.
Obviously, that was not the case.
Right. And so the 1920s, the Klan grows in popularity. It's a national movement. It's far more complex than it was in its original creation. Religion plays a role in all of that, though. How did the role of religion and their view of religion expand out their membership?
So they took this Christian doctrine and they preached it, like this is the word. This is how we're going to infiltrate these corrupt systems. And if you are a good Christian, a pure Protestant, you're going to be able to save America from all these moral injustices. So they would take, one of my favorite stories is the women of the Ku Klux Klan, they take the image of Joan of Arc. They take her and call her Joan of the Camellia.
Hang on, she was Catholic.
Yes, she was Catholic. See, there's the problem, right? They take her as the savior and they turn her Protestant. Like I said, they call her the Joan of the Camellia. And she's Catholic all along. So they just take the Catholic part of Joan and just throw it away.
Exercise.
Yes.
To use a religious term.
They just throw it away. And so there's this image of her riding through America, protecting the children, protecting wives and mothers, protecting men from, the allure of these sexualized women, not just white women, but, colored women as well. And so it's always funny to me that they preach certain things, so anti-Catholicism, but they take certain elements of Catholicism and twist them to match their narrative. And it just makes me laugh because they're constantly operating in this paradox. They take one thing and they just tweak it just enough to fit their ideology.
The problem they have with Catholics, there's social problems like the drinking and so forth, which they had thought was a problem for a long time. You mentioned the temperance movement. But the main problem that they have is they think they owe their allegiance to the Pope and not to America.
What about the role of the Catholics in this, Mr. Jones?
The reason a Catholic cannot get in this organization, his first allegiance is not to the United States of America. His first allegiance is to the Pope. They believe that the church should rule the government with the Pope at the head. And if they're right, there's a bunch of people in this country who are wrong.
And so that's the major problem. Same thing for the Eastern Orthodox. They owe their allegiance to the patriarch. But for the Jews, it's a different story. It's a different allegiance because the Jewish faith doesn't have a pope or a patriarch. It doesn't have a consolidation of power like that. What's the problem with the Jews to the KKK?
A lot of it for the women especially was just the money issue. They were very wealthy. And I know that sounds bad, but it's, they
had to have gotten it some nefarious means.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea that the Jews control the banking system. They control the money. They control society through the banks and through commerce. That's going to be used later, as we know in history. And they use that in the KKK. They bring it up in the 1920s specifically, and then of course fascism will use it as well. So going back to the women of the KKK, what were some requirements to be inducted into their
initially
society?
You had to be 18 years old. You had to be part of the WASP, so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You had to be recruited from two Kliegels, which were basically recruiting agents, or if you couldn't get two of those Kliegels, you could get an imperial commander to sign off saying, you're perfect for our organization. And the chapter had to be where a KKK chapter was already formed. And then you had to live there for, I think it was 6 months. You had to be in resident in that area. And then you could become a member. Well, as membership was growing and the Klan was growing in general, they kind of lessened the requirements. You could be 16. You didn't specifically have to live in an area that had a chapter for that long of a time. They opened up child membership. So they had the Tri-K, the Junior K. They had it separated by sexes as well. And so it really just depended what time frame you fell in when you wanted to be a member.
So what kind of social organizations did they develop? I know the men had baseball teams. They had bands. They had performers. What in the women of the KKK? What social committees and clubs and stuff did they set up?
So they had a lot of like fundraising was their main one. So they would fundraise for the Klan in its entirety, not just their specific chapters. They did a bunch of the rallying. They would form those and the picnics. So the big, the big parade in 1925 in Washington, a lot of the women organized that. It wasn't just the men. A lot of them put their hand in as well because they also marched. Well,
and you saw that in that famous march, and that's chilling when you watch that and you see the image of the Capitol in the background. And then
they're de-hooded.
As far as the eye can see, you see Klan members marching literally as far as the eye can see. And that's its apex. Okay. Interestingly, the thing that helps, not to tie it too much into fascism, but the thing that helps Hitler out is he consolidates his power through just those types of things, just social events, bowling and gymnastic clubs. And so by the time that they start to rise in power, they've already hooked all these people in one way or another. And I know that in the South in particular, it was the place to go in a community would be the Klan rallies. It was food and music and a good time. Unfortunately, towards the end of the night, when the speakers came out, is when it got a lot more dark.
You see the crosses burning in the, faraway lands.
So then it kind of dissipates over time. Like we mentioned, they say there's been about 4 clans. The Klan never really went away.
Oh no, it just goes underground for a little while.
Right. So you had the initial one after the Civil War, and now you had the reemergence in the 1920s, which we mentioned was at its apex, and it's far more diverse, and women are more actively involved. Kind of goes away for a while. And then in the 60s, it comes back again. And in the 60s, what happens is, it's really 1954 is what changes everything, because they have a segregated South. And that's why initially at the end of Reconstruction, once the white South can gain supremacy, there's not a real need for the Klan to be around. They've got the environment that they want. It's only after you see these elements that change. In the 1920s, it's urbanization. So their laws are still the same, but now all of society is changing. It's not just a black threat anymore. It's a Catholic threat. It's a Jewish threat. It's urbanization. And then it expands into the north because of migration and because of the nature of the message that's changed. But in the 60s, what happens is now there's an assault on segregation itself. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Of course, you didn't have desegregation immediately, but the writing was on the wall, and the Klan feels like we're going to have to save the South again. And in the 60s in particular, you have a guy called Bob Jones, and North Carolina becomes like the epicenter of it. And it's interesting because the reason for that is North Carolina had always projected itself as we're not the Deep South. We're more civilized. We don't have the violence. Well, when the Klan starts to develop again and becomes more socially acceptable to be in it, when you get into that type of environment, that's where it takes hold the strongest. Not that it wasn't in the Deep South, like in Alabama and Mississippi, because we know that it was. But there was a lot of focus on that because that's where the violence was at. North Carolina, not so much. There wasn't as much violence. They viewed themselves as being a little bit more, I don't know.
Civilized?
Civilized. A little more progressive. So Bob Jones, who's just this failed lightning rod salesman, that's who this guy is, but believe it or not, right? And he uses this to gain a massive movement to save the South against the civil rights movement. And so it has a resurgence. And you see all of those people coming out again, similar to the 20s, which kind of went away. And in the 20s, in the 60s, they're coming back out again. They're willing to speak to the press, who they completely thought was out to get them. They thought the press they lie and they don't tell the truth. And
similar to today.
Yeah, right. So it was always a target to them. And the Andy Griffith Show, right?
Yes.
Well, that's in North Carolina. And the view of the Andy Griffith Show is Mayberry, which doesn't exist. No. Not the actual town. It didn't really exist. But in a lot of Southerners' minds, and not just Southerners, but a lot of rural people's minds, little towns, like maybe the one you grew up in, they viewed Mayberry as this America that used to be, that's not here anymore. What they don't realize is that America never existed. It was never like that. They hearken back like things used to be better during that time period. But in North Carolina, it really takes hold because they think that America should be filled with Mayberries.
Well, I've got a wife, 5 kids. I think that's enough reason. I want them to have a country to be raised up in like I was.
So they take this fantasy, and if you remember that show, Andy Griffith is like this paternalistic. He's a sheriff, but he functions way more than a sheriff. He's solving marital problems.
Yeah.
He's fixing business complaints.
He's the father figure of the whole town.
He's the father figure of the whole town. And if you see that, there are black people in the Andy Griffith Show. There's no animosity. They're not front and center, right? But they're just there, quietly accepting. And so when Andy Griffith or the sheriff gives a talk and calms everybody's nerves down, everybody's cheering, including the black people. That is the image that the Klan uses in the 60s. They say this is the America of the past. It's exactly what they were looking for in the 20s. They saw it slipping away. They saw the urbanization. They saw the change in society. An influx of new immigrants. Now, not from England anymore.
Well, they're all over Chinese. When California got the Chinese immigration, there was actually an ad in 1914 from San Francisco. And in this ad, it said, "Mr. White America, if you have any race, pride, or patriotism, you will organize for the protection of your race." And I feel like that's a sentiment that is, heard across the nation, especially in the 20s. And you can see that kind of coming back in the 60s a little bit.
Well, they think like I mentioned, there's a fantasy that doesn't really exist. But under it all, which is never seen on the Andy Griffith Show, is the violence, which does take place. When traditional methods of intimidation don't work, the Klan has always resulted or kind of went to violence, turned to violence.
They hit me in the back of the head, told me to lay down. And they all grabbed me, stretched me out. One stood on this arm and one stood on this one. And one caught my leg and spread it apart. Then he got help from the other one, and they spread my leg apart. The boss ordered him to do your way. and they went to cutting on me. When they got through cutting me, they put turpentine on me. Said I wasn't hollering. Put turpentine on to make it hurt more. I don't believe they're human.
And that's what happens in Alabama, and civil rights workers are going down there. They're pushing for rights, voting rights, and so forth. And so once the violence takes hold, now the FBI is paying attention, and they start to infiltrate the KKK, and it starts to weaken it. They get into the preachers, and the FBI infiltrates it at every level. So now they have informants, and now they're a target. And as long as that violence happens, now that's what's always troubled the KKK. They'd gain in popularity. They'd have all this national popularity. Their leadership would be talking about, we never touched a black person. We've never officially condoned anything.
Yep. And then something sparks the violence.
And then the violence is what brings it down a notch or two. And that's what happens in the 60s. Eventually, now the interesting thing is, what really does it in is the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is the craziest thing, right? But they call the KKK to testify. And the KKK, the leadership goes up there, and they're trying to protect all the unseedy things that they're involved in. The money is not above board. They won't release their tax returns.
Well, the Klan was always notorious for money laundering.
Right.
It happened in the 20s. That's one reason why the federal government started investigating them again in the 20s. And it never goes away, you know.
So then that becomes a target. And the thing that gets their leadership, and what gets Bob Jones in particular, is they plead the fifth. Well, this is a time of anti-communism. This was the time of the Hollywood 10 and Alger Hiss. And they were pleading, and some of them were pleading the fifth. And so to a lot of Southerners who are strongly anti-communist, they're saying, what are they doing? Only communists plead the fifth. And it just completely undermines it. And that's what happens over the course of time. The FBI focuses on it. Now North Carolina realizes, as their government, their state government and local governments realize they have a problem, they target them, and then it dissipates and goes away again. What do you see today as, where is the Ku Klux Klan today?
You know, they're still around. When I went to the Southern Law Poverty Center, they have a board that tracks all the hate groups in America. And they're still on the list, but they're not the top anymore. There's the Aryan Nation or Brotherhood, and I can't remember the other ones, but they have conquered the top position of hate groups. And, but recently, especially with our political climate that we're in now, it seems like we are starting to invoke nativism again. And these people are seeing some threats.
Society's changing, just like in the 20s.
Yep, immigration again, women's rights, reproductive rights again. You know, there's all these things that are mirroring the 20s going on today. And I think there's this book out there, and I think it's called like Trump Politics or something like that. I read it, I don't know, probably a few months ago. And in it, they show the rise in hate when he takes office. And it's very interesting. I wish I could remember the name of it, but they show when he says certain things or does certain things, it rallies a certain sector of our American population.
That group that maybe not be called the Ku Klux Klan anymore, but that same group of or the same group of people who feel threatened by the change in society. The interesting thing about the Klan, if you go back, you would say these governments, whether it's state government like in North Carolina in the 60s or in the 20s when they went after the Klan had a lot of public power. They could influence politicians. they had the mayor was probably a part of the Klan. The sheriff was. You really couldn't.
Lawyers.
Right. Everybody was the judges. And so you had this situation where they were so big and powerful that they controlled segments of society. That's a challenge because now they're controlling the power. But the reality is that's easy to see. You know where the target is.
In the small community, you too often find that the sheriff is a member, or that the deputies are members. And the poor white man, or more particularly the poor Negro in a small community, he well knows that he has no protection at all. The law isn't going to help him because the law is more often than not in the Klan or sympathetic with it in the small southern community.
The problem that we have today when it's decentralized is it doesn't have that same level of power. We don't have any congressmen who are openly part of a white supremacist group that I know of.
I don't think there's any open ones.
And probably not even at the state level. There's probably very few that espouse that to that point. But it's still there, and it's decentralized. And it's not easy for, say, the FBI when there's violence to target, because it was easier for the FBI to target the Ku Klux Klan. That's who was doing it, and they could infiltrate it. Today, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, the only time you really see this sort of active outward violence is, for example, at Charlottesville. When that whole situation happened, you saw these men dressing up in robes again. And, you know, it's a frightening image, and especially since America is supposed to be equal and you're supposed to have all these opportunities and stuff, but then you see our racial past and you see it active today. And that's the scary part.
Well, most of the individuals that would get involved in it in the past, they weren't the wealthy and the elite for the most part. They weren't the totally poor, even though they probably got some of them people and some of those individuals involved in it too. It's that lower middle class, and you work really hard and you're scratching out an existence, and it's just difficult. You don't seem like you're getting ahead. And now for someone like the Klan or other groups today, now you have a target. Now you have somebody who's susceptible to that type of philosophy. You know, you can bring them in, which the Klan, of course, in the 20s and then later again in the 60s were masterful at.
So take in the individual, what if he be in the Klan or out, check the leadership. Say, for example, we have people was painter contractors. As far as I know, failures. We have people was insurance agents. As far as I know, failures. We have people with concrete business. As far as I know, failures. And such as that just failed out and flunked out, couldn't promote leadership, and just lost out everything they had. And then, and they couldn't find nothing else to do, as the fellow said. They made him a Klan's leader.
Well, I want to thank you, Nancy, for coming in today. Explaining,
not a problem.
Yeah, thank you. An important topic to remind us of those hate groups that we have to be on guard for, because you're right. In America, it should be pushing for equality and liberty, but the women's role in that was important as well. And thank you for highlighting that.
There was never a time in American history, or Klan history, I should say, after the 20s where there was a separate organization. When they reemerged, the sexes came together.
And that's what you see pretty much today. So thanks again. Our featured beer today was Zahn Belgian-style ale from the Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City. Remember to subscribe, like our Facebook page, leave a comment for your chance to win a gift card from Hy-Vee. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork. They're currently working on a new album, that's going to be released soon, so tune in for that. And join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
The Klan, to me, is a group primarily of thugs that would use the civil rights issue to foster an organization or a clan, as they are, and will take the law into their own hands. They have become more or less their own police power. They are a police group within themselves, dedicated to defiance of law, violence. They are, as I have expressed it before, they are a hooded bunch of killers and night riders and floggers that this nation and this state has no use for whatsoever.